Okay, we are live. Go ahead, KK.
Hi,
We are
Venkat.
live. Hey,
Good morning
good
to you.
afternoon, good morning.
All right, great. Think this is the first of the series where we're going to be regularly talking about AI and cybersecurity. And the first theme that we're picking today is vulnerability prioritization. So, Venkat, you as a CISO and startup founder in the past as well, and same for me, both of us have had 20 plus years in cybersecurity, but we still haven't solved the vulnerability prioritization problem effectively yet, right? We see clients with 40, 50, 100,000 vulnerabilities in their open list trackers, and tickets are opened, and IT teams are struggling to fix those issues. And yet, if you go deep into it, you find that there is a lot that could be optimized, a lot that could be made more efficient. Um, so, what's really the challenge that how does this translate to a risk for the organization? You have some stats you wanted to share those and tell us why it's such a big problem for companies.
Right. Yeah, I want to hear some comments from the viewers as well. But vulnerabilities have been and nobody loves vulnerabilities, right? Any of the security engineers, whenever we open up a vulnerability report, we kind of get scared a little bit with respect to how many number of vulnerabilities are there, how can we explain them to the patching teams, what are the reports we need to write to auditors, and how to explain that to the, uh, the, the third-party auditors, the SLAs and all that stuff. Beyond the compliance, I think there's a huge problem with respect to the carrying those vulnerabilities and not understanding them. And this is from the Verizon DBIR report, the annual DBIR report. It's kind of sad. You talked about the vulnerability vendors, vulnerability programs existing in the organizations for the last 20 plus years. But still, the number one, the biggest growth in terms of the initial access for breaches is still vulnerabilities. It's not zero-day vulnerabilities. It's not the vulnerabilities that nobody knows. These are vulnerabilities that are known and have patches available. And it is interesting and sad to see that the number one entry point into breaches is known vulnerabilities. The second stat is the number of days that organizations take to fix the known vulnerabilities. It's about 60 days. And the number of days that it takes attackers to exploit the known vulnerabilities is about 7 days. So it's whenever there is a vulnerability, known vulnerability, the attackers are taking within 5 to 7 days. They are having exploit code. They're trying to exploit the vulnerabilities. And it's taking 60 days on average for an organization to fix them. The gap between those 7 days and 60 days is when the breaches are happening, and that is the biggest entry point into all the breaches. So it's the vulnerability problem, so to speak, the number of vulnerabilities we all see, they have real big implications for organization security, for sure.
Right. And I think if you just rely on CVSS or even on EPSS, it's not sufficient, because there are so many other factors that come into play in terms of being truly able to prioritize those vulnerabilities. But then you have all these added solutions, BAS and continuous red teaming and attack surface management, and all of this also trying to come together to help companies prioritize. Qualys, for example, has the true risk score. But before we get to that, there's also a challenge with just relying on NVD as a source of vulnerability information, right? The National Vulnerability Database, um, which incidentally is run by the US government and is under probably under the same funding constraints as other government departments are coming. So could you take show us a glimpse of what's happening at NVD right now?
Yes, yeah. The stats change a little bit. Last February, I think, is when NVD had a huge backlog. About, I mean, they did not process 90% of the vulnerabilities, and then it improved a little bit with respect to the processing. But on in general, the first stat here is about maybe at any given month or a week or this year, I think about 12,000 vulnerabilities got reported and 9,000 got processed. So at any given time, and last week, I'm looking at the stats here, 812 got reported and 400 got analyzed. So we're about 40% not analyzed this year and 50% not analyzed this week. So there is still a significant number of vulnerabilities that are getting reported to NVD and there are patches available and all that, but they're not getting analyzed. And what it means is that NVD has not mapped the CVE to a particular vendor. There is no CPE, and there's huge chance that scanners won't have it until NVD is analyzed. So the top of the funnel with respect to where the vulnerabilities are getting reported and analyzed, there's a huge backlog that the bucket is getting filled more rapidly with more number of vulnerabilities, and the analysis that needs to happen with respect to attribution, with respect to impact, etc., is not catching up. So there is a large number of vulnerabilities that are getting reported that are not getting analyzed. So there is a part of the reason is the top of the bucket problem, which is the number of vulnerabilities reported and number of vulnerabilities getting analyzed, for sure.
Yeah, I'm just on the NVD website right now. It's 24,508 CVs are awaiting analysis. 6,498 are being analyzed. So if a scanner or if your source of truth is NVD, you'll be kind of blind on about 24,000 vulnerabilities that are reported and known, as you said, with vendor patches and advisories out there. And some of them like happen to be some pretty severe ones with the very high CVSS of 8 or 9, even 9.8 scores. And for some, the exploits are even out. So this is one of the key challenges that we have. The other is just the sheer number, right? The sheer signal to noise ratio that we have. So I wanted to kind of give a glimpse of what a typical organization is dealing with on an ongoing basis. And this is just a sample. So by the time I load this, those who have joined us, if you have any comments, any questions, please put them in the chat and we'll take them up. Hi Arun, hi Abis. What are you guys seeing in terms of vulnerability management? What tools are helpful, what are not? So this Venkat is a pivot on a typical vulnerability scan report. So I've just taken two data points, the title of the vulnerability and this is a Qualys output, and the count of those vulnerabilities. So you can see that in this current data set, there's about 5,200 odd vulnerabilities. And Qualys does its own logic and analysis and assigns all these vulnerabilities with what they call a true risk score. But even there, for example, let's look at even if we look at the top 10 percentile of issues, which let's say come in 800 or above, right? Please excuse my rudimentary Excel skills or lack thereof. So let's just take so vulnerabilities above 800. That's still out of the 7,000. That's still about 1,400 vulnerabilities. So that's still a significant count. But if you get into the weeds, right? So, for example, um, this particular issue of uh, denial of service, and there's a whole bunch of denial of service vulnerabilities. Now, in my view, if Apache Tomcat is running internal to the organization, it's an internal application, then a denial of service on an internally hosted, internally used application isn't that big an issue in most cases, um, as the true risk score would imply. Even cross-site scripting, if it's a cross-site scripting on an internally hosted application, it's not exposed to the internet, it's not exposed to partners or vendors. You could actually downgrade this, maybe not to a low, but definitely not to the highest rating which we have here. And this goes on, right? A lot of these vulnerabilities, privilege escalation for sure, you'd want to fix it because it could get exploited in an internal chain of vulnerabilities. Uh, Birthday attacks. Again, if this is an internal one, I wouldn't give it a lot of importance. Here are more denial of service attacks. So if we just kind of filter for libcurl denial of service, right? So again, there are 13 um, count of vulnerabilities over here. Um, so this gives you an idea of the kind of signal to noise ratio that we're dealing with. And this requires us to bring in a lot of organizational context. So, for example, Notepad++ denial of service vulnerability, right? Why would you want to put resources on this and kind of the same level of importance you're giving to your database security issues, right? Which are definitely very very critical. Internal, external, doesn't matter. uh, Whether that database is used for an internal hosted application or external hosted application. um, so this is the kind of contextualization that is very much required. Again, a lot of these, if you look at most vulnerability scan reports, you'll find a lot of SSL TLS issues which are not exploitable. And again, these are internally, if a lot of the times these are internal hosted applications. So that kind of stuff can definitely be reduced in terms of the priority that is given. So this is the kind of detail we usually get into, in terms of um, who, what this system is, what does it host, where is it located. We have to take into account the network architecture. We have to take into account also, for example, a very critical issue that is not being addressed here is existing security tools, right? So, Venkat, do you want to speak to that, in terms of existing controls that might be there?
Yeah. So for example, the Tomcat you touched on, the internal, it should not get that much priority, even if it's external. If the organization is non-retail, right? There is no dollar impact on the reduced performance of Tomcat, then you don't need to go to the development team and ask them to stop the feature up, ask them to stop the sprint and fix the Tomcat, because there is not much dollar impact with regards to the fix of the vulnerability, for sure. There's also good comments from the audience. For example, even when you patch the vulnerabilities, uh, they don't really, the patching tools, they don't really patch the vulnerability. Patching the vulnerability usually means that in Windows you have to make some manual changes to registries. Even on Linux, if you have kernel vulnerabilities, it's not sufficient just to apply the patch. You have to reboot the systems. There is a lot of nuances involved with respect to fixing the vulnerability. So there are a few good comments with regards to the patching process as well, which escalates that issue. Uh, Let me even before I think there's a problem at a foundational level
Hmm.
as well, um, on prioritization of vulnerabilities and the tools and techniques we have with respect to the prioritization.
Hmm.
Uh, Let me share, and maybe the audience will shed a light on this as well. Um, there are 3 or 4 metrics that pretty much, can you see my screen? I see a blue screen.
Yeah, it's a blue screen.
Let me share the window again. I don't know why it's a blue screen. Let me present again. Let me try this again. I will share the entire screen now. Can you see the entire screen now?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So I apologize. The entire screen is not working. So the first tool that we have is the CVSS scores. The CVSS scores, if you take a look at them, the distribution of the CVSS scores on the entire CVE, the number of CVEs that are critical and high rated are above 50%. So 50% of the CVEs reported are given rating of more than 7 and higher. If you look at the SLAs, organizational SLAs, depending on which compliance you're on, and if you're on FedRAMP, critical is 15 days. If you're on, maybe SOC 2, critical is 30 days, and high is, maybe 45 days. So they're expecting that half of the CVEs are remediated within 30 to 45 days. If you take a look at any CVE, there's 50% chance that it is higher critical rated. That cannot be true, right? Among the 250,000 CVEs that we are getting, if CVSS score is taken into account for prioritization, then we have to resolve half of the CVEs within 30 to 45 days. So there is that problem of prioritization using CVSS as a prioritization tool. That's when the CVE got reported. The NVD scores that. So there's a scoring problem with respect to when the CV gets reported. If you look at the problem from bottoms up, when the CV gets exploited, it gets added to the CSAP known exploits list. That is when the CV is getting actively exploited and there is remediation. This is the number of total CVEs, and the number of CVEs on the known exploit list is this green circle. I think less than like about single-digit percentage of the total number of vulnerabilities are on this list. So that's if you look at the total number of CVEs, half of them are high and critical and high. So that's a scoring problem. If you look at from the bottoms up and look at the number of CVEs that we know are actively getting exploited, that's a very, very, very small list. The second metric, or the third metric that people use to prioritize is the EPSS score, which is for sure we need to use both KEV and EPSS. The problem with EPSS is looking at the probability that a given CVE will get exploited in the next 30 days, depending on what the existing exploitability trends are, whether there is exploit code that appeared in Metasploit, things like that. But even then, if you look at the EPSS scores of the vulnerabilities, at a given time, the probability is above, let's say, even 50-60% or 40%. They're very, very, very low. The number of vulnerabilities that have exploitation is more than 40%, is like 2%. So it is the scores, whether it's a known exploit database or the EPSS scores, the coverage is very, very low. And from the CVSS score, the coverage is too high. So that gets to the core of the prioritization problem, that if I use CVSS scores, then I have to patch a large number, and the efficiency is very, very low because you're throwing a large number of vulnerabilities at the development team or patching teams to fix. And if you use this CSAP KEV or EPSS, you're just focusing on very, very small number of vulnerabilities. And usually these vulnerabilities are pretty old, because once it gets into CSAP KEV, that means that it's probably 2020, 2022 2 or 3 years back vulnerabilities that are getting exploited now and getting added, and therefore you're too late into the game. So that gets into the core of why the number of vulnerabilities, known vulnerabilities that are not still patched, is still a large number, and that is contributing to the organizations not patching the right vulnerabilities and going after the wrong ones as well. So kind of get into the lay of the land with respect to why prioritization is a big problem.
Mm. Yeah, and a difficult problem to solve. And Udit has come in with a good comment that you have to take into account so many other parameters, right? The asset, the nature of the asset, the criticality of the asset, the location, the threat landscape, the exposure of the asset, accessibility to the asset, the business impact, existing controls, etc. And yeah, Udit, to that point, just to give a glimpse of how we are looking to address it. So, for example, for the same vulnerability that I showed earlier, this is our um, prioritization list. So, taking into account multiple factors and parameters, we come up with this prioritization. So, you can see, for example, here.
You're
Uh,
not sharing. KK, can't see the screen.
oh,
There you
okay.
go. It's coming up now. Yeah, now I can.
Okay, cool. So this is pretty much the same output as we saw earlier in the pivot table, right? And I think this is the same. But here, for example, this is a 6.8 CVSS, and it's rated in the same bucket as the other ones, which are even higher, 9.8, for example. There's even a 4.6 that's mentioned over here. Now, this, if we went by just the CVSS or just the EPSS, something like this would actually come much lower. But the reason that this is at a higher risk score in our analysis is because there is an active exploit for it, which if you just scroll a few, there is an active exploit, and the exploitation risk is also pretty high. No workarounds are available. So taking into account all of those parameters, and then we'll show a glimpse in maybe the uh, next week's session on how we even take into account the existing security controls. So now, if you see, you're down to what's this? Some 24 vulnerabilities that really need attention right now. And then there's a whole bunch that we've put in, maybe what you can patch in the next 10 days, right? And then next 30 days, etc. But even here, you'll find, for example, there is vulnerabilities with CVSS scores, which are pretty high, but they'll come lower in the prioritization for us. So here, for example, this one is a CVS is 6.7, but because no exploit is available, it's probably not remotely exploitable, etc. We will downgrade the risk from that issue. And of course, if we bring in your firewall configuration, your AD configuration, your asset list information, then we can score it even more accurately.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, there are a couple of comments around the business context and organizational context as well, and it's not a easy thing to determine with respect to. It's not only whether you have a firewall or not. There is that basic, but also there is a lot of angles to the business context, right? With respect to what is your business, right? Take a top level. You're in retail. Backup servers are important for some customers. Some customers retail and web servers are more important. And then the processes, release processes, etc. Sometimes the bash and servers, etc. are more important, and because they're used for CI/CD pipelines. And if they go down, the entire development team goes down. So it's very important to bring in not just the reachability of internet exposure, things like that, but also asset importance, complaints importance of a given asset group, reachability in terms of what is the dollar impact. If you can put a dollar impact on that particular CVE, there is a dollar column, and you organize that by dollar column, and above whatever dollars you prior to the CVEs, and you can clearly explain all the angles to the entire team. that would be a good start. It's a tough problem, and as you said, we try to tackle that problem, and we can chat about those angles and how we tackle that problem in the next call, because I think we're probably over time now.
Yes. So next week, I think we'll deep dive into how we are looking to solve it, how LLMs and AI can help us to a very large extent, combined with being able to integrate and extract as much information from the organizational context as we can. So thank you everyone who's joined. We can maybe spend a few minutes, maybe taking any questions that you might have. I think we've addressed almost all the comments that have come in.
Yep, that is true.
Yeah, that's true. We didn't. We addressed the fact that scanners don't take into account business and organizational context, which, as I was hinting, AI can help us understand that to a fair extent on coming in from different aspects, right? Like I said, the network architecture, the firewall configurations, the asset name, even any information that's there in an asset database. Though we know how problematic asset management, configuration management databases and asset lists usually are, but nevertheless,
Right.
at least in terms of classifying production and development, they ought to be accurate. All right, folks, it was great presenting to all of you, and please send us your feedback. Continue to send us your feedback in the comments. Check out Transilience .ai. Let me just put that in the. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks,
So
Al.
that's
See you guys.
okay. Bye bye.